She shaped over 1,000 young minds. Former students became doctors, teachers, and community leaders, all because of Barbara Johnson. But tonight, as she sits forgotten in a plastic hospital chair, she's just another elderly patient taking up space. The same society that once celebrated her contributions now sees her as a burden, a problem to be managed efficiently. One overworked resident is about to discover why that's not just wrong, it's literally killing her. At 78, she had taught third grade for 37 years at Eastwood Elementary, raised 3 children after her husband died in a construction accident, and volunteered at the local food bank every Saturday for the past decade. But tonight, after collapsing in her ranch-style home's kitchen while preparing her weekly meal prep, she felt smaller than she had in decades, invisible, disposable, and utterly alone in a world that seemed to have moved on without her. Dr. Michael Stevens had been working 18-hour shifts for 3 days straight when Barbara's case landed on his desk. The 32-year-old resident was running on Red Bull and sheer determination, mechanically processing the endless stream of patients that flowed through Charlotte's busiest emergency room. When he glanced at Barbara's chart, he saw what the system saw. Elderly Caucasian female, possible cardiac event, Medicare coverage, emergency contact unavailable. Just another case number in a night full of medical puzzles to solve quickly and efficiently before his shift supervisor started asking questions about patient throughput. "Mrs. Johnson?" Michael called out, barely looking up from his tablet as he approached her corner of the waiting area. Barbara looked up with eyes that had once lit up classrooms and commanded the attention of hundreds of third graders over nearly 4 decades, but now seemed clouded with confusion and the particular fear that comes with aging alone in America. She nodded slightly, her hands trembling as she tried to pull the thin hospital blanket around her shoulders, not just for warmth, but for the dignity that seemed to evaporate in medical settings when you reached a certain age. Michael had learned in medical school at Duke University to maintain professional distance, to see patients as collections of symptoms rather than complete human beings with rich histories and ongoing stories. It was a survival mechanism in a profession where emotional attachment could lead to burnout, especially in emergency medicine where life and death decisions happened hourly. But something about Barbara's posture, the way she held herself with stubborn pride despite her obvious vulnerability, the way she apologized for taking up space when he approached, made him pause mid-stride. She wasn't just another elderly patient taking up a bed during the busy Friday night shift. She was someone who had clearly been someone important once, sitting alone in a sterile hospital at 11:30 on a cold February evening. Her purse, clutched tightly in her lap, was worn but well-maintained leather, the kind teachers used to carry to school every day for decades. Her gray hair was still carefully styled despite the medical emergency, and her fingernails, though unpolished, were neatly trimmed. These were the details of a woman who took pride in her appearance, who had maintained standards even as the world around her seemed to care less and less about who she was or what she had accomplished. "Let's get you somewhere more comfortable, Mrs. Johnson," Michael said, his voice softening unconsciously as he noticed the way she struggled to stand. As he helped Barbara to her feet, he noticed how she winced with each movement, her arthritic joints protesting after hours in the hard plastic chair. More troubling was the way she immediately apologized for being so much trouble, as if her medical emergency was an inconvenience she should feel guilty about. How many healthcare workers had rushed her through procedures over the years, too busy to notice her discomfort or acknowledge her as a person rather than a problem to solve efficiently. In examination room 12, Michael began his assessment with practiced efficiency, but found himself slowing down as he observed Barbara's responses to his questions. When he asked about her symptoms, she answered with the careful precision of someone accustomed to explaining things clearly, a teacher's habit that had persisted long after retirement. Her voice carried the remnants of authority that had once kept classrooms of 8-year-olds engaged in learning, but now seemed diminished by years of being dismissed as just another senior in a youth-obsessed culture. Several times Barbara started to mention details about her life, then stopped herself, as if she had learned through experience that healthcare providers didn't have time for personal stories, that her identity as a former educator and community volunteer was irrelevant to her current medical needs. Her medical history, when Michael finally coaxed it from her, revealed a woman who had worked tirelessly until mandatory retirement at 65, then continued volunteering and substitute teaching until her 70s, gradually scaling back activities as her energy waned and her social circle shrank through deaths and relocations to assisted living facilities. "Mrs. Johnson," Michael said, unconsciously sitting down in the chair beside her examination table rather than hovering over her with his clipboard. "Can you tell me exactly what happened before you collapsed tonight?" Barbara's eyes widened slightly at the genuine interest in his voice. When was the last time someone had asked her to tell her story rather than just answer yes or no questions? She began describing how she had been preparing her weekly Sunday meal prep, a habit that helped her eat nutritious meals throughout the week and gave structure to her otherwise increasingly empty days. But as Barbara talked, other details emerged that painted a picture of gradual social isolation that had become endemic among American seniors. She hadn't had a meaningful conversation with another person in over a week, except for brief exchanges with grocery store cashiers and the pharmacist at CVS, who filled her growing collection of prescription bottles. Her 3 adult children lived in different states, one in Seattle working for Microsoft, another in Phoenix managing a hotel chain, and the youngest in Miami working as a nurse practitioner. They called dutifully on Sundays and remembered her birthday, but their own busy lives raising teenagers and managing careers left little time for extended visits or deep connection with their aging mother. The chest pains that had brought Barbara to the emergency room had started while she was cooking her famous sweet potato casserole, the same recipe she had perfected during her teaching years and brought to countless school potlucks, church dinners, and community events. "I was thinking about how I used to make 6 pans of this for the school Thanksgiving feast," she said wistfully, "and now I make one small dish that lasts me a week." The comment revealed not just her physical isolation, but the way her sense of purpose and usefulness had gradually eroded as the communities that had once valued her contributions moved on without her. Michael found himself genuinely engaged by Barbara's story, recognizing in her the teachers who had shaped his own childhood in small-town North Carolina before his family moved to Charlotte when he was in high school. "You taught 3rd grade for 37 years?" he asked, and Barbara's transformation was immediate and remarkable. Her back straightened, her eyes brightened with remembered passion, and for the first time since arriving at the hospital, she smiled with genuine warmth rather than the polite, apologetic expression she had worn like armor. "Eastwood Elementary," Barbara said with quiet pride, her voice growing stronger as she described the thousands of children she had guided through those crucial early years of formal education. She talked about teaching phonics when it was unfashionable, about staying late to help struggling readers, about spending her own money on classroom supplies during budget cuts. She described the satisfaction of watching reluctant learners discover the joy of reading, of seeing shy children find their voices, of being the stable adult presence in chaotic young lives. "I still have letters," Barbara said, her voice catching slightly with emotion. "Hundreds of them, from students who grew up to become doctors and mechanics and teachers themselves. They write to tell me how I made a difference, how I believed in them when they didn't believe in themselves." She paused, looking down at her hands. "But that feels like another lifetime now. The school replaced me with someone young and energetic, with new ideas about education technology and data-driven instruction. I understand, of course. It's just, sometimes I feel like everything I learned, everything I knew about teaching children, just disappeared with me." The preliminary tests showed that Barbara had suffered a minor heart episode, serious enough to require monitoring, but not immediately life-threatening. Standard protocol would be to stabilize her, prescribe cardiac medications, arrange follow-up care with a cardiologist, and discharge her back to the empty ranch house, where she would continue her slow fade into irrelevance. Michael had processed dozens of similar cases during his residency. Elderly patients caught in the gap between independence and institutionalization, medically stable but socially dying. But something about Barbara's story wouldn't let him follow the standard playbook. Maybe it was remembering his own 3rd-grade teacher, Mrs. Patterson, who had patiently helped him overcome his reading difficulties and sparked his love of science. Maybe it was the recognition that this woman sitting before him had probably shaped hundreds of lives in ways that continued to ripple through generations. Or maybe it was simply the realization that American society had become expert at extending life without considering what made that extended life worth living. "Mrs. Johnson," Michael said carefully, "I know this might sound like an unusual question from your emergency room doctor, but would you mind telling me about your teaching methods? I'm curious about how you handled children who were struggling academically." The question seemed to catch Barbara off guard. When was the last time someone had asked for her professional expertise rather than just her insurance information and next-of-kin contact? What followed was the most extraordinary conversation of Michael's medical career. Barbara's voice grew animated as she described her classroom management techniques, her approaches to differentiated learning, her strategies for working with children from difficult home situations. Her hands, which had shaken with anxiety during the medical examination, became steady and expressive as she demonstrated how she used to guide children's fingers when teaching them to form letters, how she would get down to their eye level when having serious conversations, how she created safe spaces for shy children to participate in class discussions. The secret, Barbara said, leaning forward conspiratorially, was never talking down to them. Children know when adults think they're stupid or unimportant. I treated every 8-year-old like they had something valuable to say, like their questions mattered, like their dreams were worth pursuing. Amazing how that simple respect could transform a child's entire attitude toward learning. As Barbara spoke, Michael realized he was witnessing something profound, the reawakening of a master teacher who had been silenced not by incompetence or failure, but simply by a society that discarded expertise the moment it came packaged in an aging body. Her insights about child development, classroom management, and educational psychology were as sharp and relevant as ever, yet they were locked away in a lonely house, unutilized and unvalued. The nursing staff began to take notice of the unusual sounds coming from examination room 12. Not the typical medical conversations about symptoms and treatments, but genuine laughter and animated discussion. Nurse Jennifer Martinez, who had been struggling with her own 8-year-old son's reading difficulties, found herself lingering outside the door, catching fragments of Barbara's advice about phonics instruction and building reading confidence. "Excuse me," Jennifer finally interrupted, stepping into the room with professional confidence, masking personal desperation. "I couldn't help overhearing your conversation about teaching reading. My son Marcus is in 3rd grade, and he's really struggling. His teacher says he might need to repeat the year, and I don't know how to help him." Barbara's response was immediate and transformative. She shifted into full teacher mode, asking detailed questions about Marcus's specific challenges, offering concrete strategies Jennifer could implement at home, sharing resources and techniques that had worked with hundreds of similar children over her decades in the classroom. Within minutes, other staff members began gravitating toward room 12. Hospital security guard David Wilson mentioned his granddaughter's difficulties with math anxiety. Orderly Patricia Adams asked about helping her nephew with behavioral problems at school. Even Dr. Sarah Chun, the attending emergency physician, found herself drawn into Barbara's impromptu educational consulting session when she mentioned her concerns about her 5-year-old daughter's preparation for kindergarten. What struck everyone was not just Barbara's knowledge, though her expertise was clearly extensive, but her genuine enthusiasm for helping children succeed. After years of retirement where her greatest intellectual challenges involved crossword puzzles and managing her medications, Barbara was suddenly back in her element, solving complex educational problems and offering hope to worried parents and grandparents. The confused, frightened patient from the intake notes had been replaced by a confident professional, her eyes bright with purpose as she dispensed wisdom earned through decades of dedication to children's learning and development. Dr. Sarah Chin pulled Michael aside as the informal education conference continued in room 12. "This is highly irregular," she said, though her tone was more curious than critical. "We've got a cardiac patient holding court like she's running a parent-teacher conference." She paused, watching Barbara patiently explain reading comprehension strategies to Jennifer Martinez, while simultaneously helping David Wilson understand how to support his granddaughter's mathematical thinking. "But look at her vitals. Her blood pressure has stabilized, her heart rate is normal, and her color has improved dramatically. Whatever's happening in there, it's working better than our medications." As the night shift progressed, Barbara's bedside had transformed into an informal community resource center. Hospital staff were pulling out their phones to show her pictures of children and grandchildren, asking for advice about everything from potty training to college preparation. Barbara responded to each request with the focused attention and practical wisdom that had made her legendary among generations of Eastwood elementary families. She remembered techniques for every challenge, had stories about similar situations she had handled, and offered hope to adults who had been struggling to help the children in their lives. "You know," Barbara said to the growing group around her bed, "this is what I missed most about retirement. Not the lesson planning or the grading. I was happy to leave that behind. But this, being able to help children learn and grow, being useful to families who are struggling with the most important job in the world, raising good human beings. I felt like I died a little bit when I stopped being needed for this." Michael realized he was witnessing something unprecedented in his medical training, the healing power of purpose restored. Barbara's cardiac symptoms had largely resolved, not just from the medical treatment, but from the recognition that she still had immense value to offer her community. The chest pains and shortness of breath that had brought her to the emergency room seemed almost secondary to the spiritual and emotional revival happening in examination room 12. The transformation was so dramatic that Michael began documenting it, recognizing that he might be observing something important about the relationship between social connection, purpose, and physical health in elderly patients. Barber's case challenged everything he had learned about aging in medical school, where elderly patients were typically viewed through the lens of decline, disease management, and end-of-life planning, rather than as repositories of wisdom and experience that could benefit their communities. When Barber's daughter Rebecca finally arrived from her home in South Charlotte, having driven through Friday night traffic after receiving Michael's call, she was shocked to find her mother surrounded by a crowd of healthcare workers hanging on her every word. Rebecca had expected to find a frail, confused woman ready for serious conversations about assisted living and diminished independence. Instead, she discovered the vibrant, commanding presence she remembered from her own childhood, when her mother had been the most respected teacher at Eastwood Elementary and a pillar of their community. "Mom," Rebecca whispered, hardly recognizing the animated woman holding court in the hospital bed. Barbara looked up and smiled with the warmth that had always made her children feel like the most important people in the world. "Hello, sweetheart. I'm sorry you had to drive all the way down here. As you can see, I'm feeling much better now." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears as she watched her mother interact with the hospital staff. When had she stopped seeing her mother as the remarkable educator and community leader she had always been? When had Barbara become just elderly mom who needs checking on rather than the woman who had shaped hundreds of young lives and possessed decades of hard-earned wisdom about human development and education? "I had no idea you were still so yourself," Rebecca said, unconsciously echoing the surprise of adult children across America who had gradually stopped seeing their aging parents as complete, capable human beings. Barbara's response was gentle but pointed. "Honey, I never stopped being myself. The world just stopped needing what I had to offer. Tonight reminded me that maybe there's still a place for what I know." The reunion that followed was emotional and transformative, not just for Barbara and Rebecca, but for everyone who witnessed it. Rebecca began really talking to her mother for the first time in years. Not just the dutiful check-ins about health and finances, but genuine conversations about Barbara's experiences, insights, and ongoing dreams. She learned that her mother had been writing children's stories based on her classroom experiences, that she had been developing innovative reading techniques that addressed modern learning challenges, that she had been volunteering to tutor struggling readers until the program was discontinued due to liability concerns. "Mom, why didn't you ever tell me about these projects?" Rebecca asked, guilt-stricken by her own neglect of her mother's intellectual and creative life. Barbara's answer was heartbreaking in its simplicity. "You were busy with your own life, your own children, your own career. I didn't want to be a burden. I thought my teaching days were behind me, that what I knew wasn't relevant anymore." The other hospital staff watched this family, healing with recognition and regret, many of them thinking about their own elderly relatives who might be sitting alone right now, their own stories and knowledge slowly fading in isolation. America's cult of youth and efficiency had created a generation of elders who felt obligated to minimize their own needs and contributions, to apologize for taking up space, to gradually fade away rather than assert their continued value to their families and communities. Dr. Chen approached Michael as the night shift was ending, having observed the remarkable transformation in room 12 throughout the evening. "Dr. Stevens, what you facilitated tonight violated several hospital efficiency protocols," she said, her expression serious. Michael braced himself for criticism about patient throughput and resource management. "It was also the most important medicine I've seen practiced in this emergency department in 15 years. She paused, watching Barbara embrace each staff member goodbye with the warmth of a beloved teacher, sending students home at the end of a school day. That woman didn't just need cardiac medication. She needed to remember her own worth, her own continued relevance to the world. You gave her something we don't have a prescription for, the recognition that her knowledge and experience still matter, that she still has gifts to offer her community." As Barbara prepared to leave the hospital, she was no longer the invisible, frightened patient who had sat alone in the waiting room. She was a woman with renewed purpose, surrounded by people who valued her expertise and experience. 5 nurses had asked for her phone number to get advice about helping children in their lives. David Wilson wanted her to meet his granddaughter, who was struggling with reading. Jennifer Martinez was planning to bring her son Marcus to meet the teacher who understands how to help kids like him. Most importantly, Rebecca had begun making plans to connect her mother with local organizations that could benefit from her educational expertise. The Charlotte-Mecklenburg Library System was always looking for volunteer literacy tutors. The Boys and Girls Club needed mentors for their after-school programs. Several elementary schools in the district were struggling with reading scores and could benefit from Barbara's decades of experience with remedial instruction. Michael walked Barbara and Rebecca to the hospital's main entrance as the Saturday morning sun painted Charlotte's skyline in golden light. The medical center sat in the heart of a city that was home to thousands of retired educators, social workers, nurses, and other professionals whose expertise was being wasted while communities struggled with problems these experienced individuals could help solve. "Dr. Stevens," Barbara said, taking his hand in both of hers with the firm grip of someone who had spent decades guiding children. "You saved my life tonight, but not in the way you might think." She paused, choosing her words with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime explaining complex concepts to young minds. "I came here dying, not from heart problems, but from irrelevance. You reminded me that I am still someone, that my knowledge still has value, that my experience can still make a difference in children's lives. That kind of healing doesn't come in pill bottles." 6 months later, Michael received an invitation to Barbara Johnson's 79th birthday party, held at the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Main Library's community room. Barbara was now volunteering 20 hours a week as a literacy tutor, had started a support group for retired educators who wanted to continue contributing to children's education, and was working with the school district to develop mentorship programs that paired experienced retirees with new teachers struggling with classroom management and student engagement. The party was attended by dozens of people whose lives Barbara had touched, not just during her teaching career, but in the months since her emergency room awakening. Parents whose children had flourished under her tutoring guidance, new teachers who had found confidence through her mentorship, librarians who had watched struggling readers transform under Barbara's patient instruction. At 79, she was busier and more fulfilled than she had been in years, her calendar filled with tutoring sessions, mentoring meetings, and educational consulting opportunities. During the celebration, Barbara stood to address the crowd, her voice carrying all the authority and warmth that had made her a beloved teacher for nearly 4 decades. "I want to thank a young doctor who saved my life by seeing me as more than my medical chart," she said, her eyes finding Michael in the crowd. "6 months ago, I thought my useful life was over, that everything I had learned about teaching and helping children was irrelevant in today's world. Dr. Stevens reminded me that experience doesn't expire, that wisdom doesn't have a retirement age, and that there are still children who need what I have to offer." She gestured to the crowd around her, former students now in their 40s and 50s, parents whose children she was currently tutoring, young teachers who sought her advice, community members who had rediscovered the value of connecting with experienced elders. "Tonight, surrounded by all of you, I am not just an elderly woman with cardiac issues. I am Barbara Johnson, master teacher, and I still have so much to give." Michael raised his glass along with everyone else, but his vision was blurred with emotion. Barbara had taught him something that would transform his entire approach to medicine, that healing often requires nothing more complicated than recognizing the inherent dignity, wisdom, and continued potential of every person who seeks care. In a profession increasingly focused on data, efficiency, and technological solutions, Barbara had shown him the power of simply seeing and valuing the whole person, their history, their expertise, their ongoing capacity to contribute meaningfully to their communities. The lesson Barbara taught him that night in examination room 12 became the foundation of a new approach that began spreading through Presbyterian Medical Center and eventually to other hospitals throughout the Charlotte area. Michael pioneered programs that connected elderly patients with community organizations that could benefit from their expertise, treating social isolation and loss of purpose as medical conditions that required intervention just as urgently as cardiac disease or diabetes. His research on the relationship between social purpose and health outcomes in elderly patients gained national attention, challenging the medical establishment to consider loneliness, irrelevance, and social disconnection as serious threats to physical health. Barbara became his most famous case study, the retired teacher whose cardiac symptoms resolved as dramatically through restored purpose as through medication, whose transformation illustrated the healing power of being needed, valued, and respected. But for Michael, the technical achievements and research publications mattered less than the fundamental truth Barbara had revealed, that in a society obsessed with youth and efficiency, America was wasting vast reservoirs of wisdom, experience, and skill by discarding elderly citizens the moment they became perceived as burdens rather than resources. The emergency room encounter had shown him that age discrimination wasn't just a social justice issue. It was a public health crisis that was literally killing people who still had enormous value to offer their communities. The story of that night in examination room 12 became legendary throughout Charlotte's medical community, passed down from one generation of healthcare workers to the next as a powerful reminder that the most important healing sometimes has nothing to do with medications or procedures. It served as evidence that treating elderly patients with dignity, curiosity, and respect for their life experience could produce medical outcomes that no pharmaceutical intervention could match. Barbara continued her work as an educational consultant and literacy advocate well into her 80s. Her expertise, sought by school districts, libraries, and community organizations throughout North Carolina. Her story became a model for other communities struggling to address both educational challenges and the social isolation of elderly residents, demonstrating that these seemingly separate problems could be solved simultaneously by connecting experienced elders with institutions that needed their knowledge and skills. Most importantly, Barbara's transformation inspired her own family to fundamentally change how they thought about aging and the value of elderly relatives. Rebecca moved back to Charlotte to be closer to her mother, not to provide care for a declining parent, but to learn from a woman whose wisdom and experience had been undervalued for too long. Barbara's grandchildren began seeking her advice, not just out of politeness, but because they recognized her as someone who understood how to navigate life's challenges with grace, wisdom, and purpose. The emergency room that had once seemed like a symbol of Barbara's decline became the setting for her renaissance, proof that American society's greatest resource might be the very population it had been too quick to dismiss as irrelevant. In a culture that worshipped youth and innovation, Barbara Johnson had demonstrated that sometimes the most revolutionary act was simply recognizing that experience, wisdom, and the desire to serve never truly retire. They just wait patiently for someone to remember their value.